Good afternoon. My name is Calvin Richard, and today I will be discussing Wyatt's Rebellion, an extremely tumultuous event from the Tudor era of Great Britain. Seeing as Great Britain doesn't have many rebellions in its time, it's important to understand why it happened. Primarily, it was because of this man, King Philip II, as Queen Mary had announced that she was to marry him. The primary problem was he was from Spain. This angered many British subjects. They didn't want a Spanish ruler. They wanted a king from Britain for Britain, and they did not want any secondary king coming in, taking the throne, and essentially ruling over two nations at the same time, two nations which had been adversaries for a long, long time. At the same time, with her marriage to King Philip, this would make both the king and queen extremely Catholic, which was a scary thought for Protestants everywhere in Great Britain. They didn't want this. They wanted a more moderate means of ruling. They wanted someone who was for their interests, obviously. But with this, they would have prosecution just for their belief. It's important to note that this wasn't the only reason that people had disliked Queen Mary. She was seen as very steadfast in her beliefs, very stubborn, inept at ruling, and didn't listen to her subjects. She would put in a policy and she stuck to it, and other people could say things and she would not care. This wasn't good for nobles and peasants alike. As mentioned, she was very heavily Catholic and wanted to reverse many of the Protestant-based rules set forth by King Henry VIII. One such rule heavily angered noblemen because it involved returning the land that had been confiscated during Henry VIII's time and returning it to the church. This confiscated land was given to the nobles and distributed equally, elevating their status, their prospects, and their titles. Taking it away would effectively lose them a great amount of money and lower their status in society. They didn't like this at all. At the same time, peasants were extremely angry because it felt as if their woes had been left on deaf ears with Queen Mary. There was heavy inflation in the country at the time. There were food shortages, leaving many people destitute and starving, as well as many taxes laid on important goods such as cloth, wine, and beer. Many people, as you can see from the bottom picture, were left as vagrants, begging for coin to simply get by and not die. This was made harder by the fact that during this time, there was a heavy wave of plague and influenza, which killed off many of the people at the time. It was one of the worst waves of disease in this era. Because of many of these reasons, it was suspected that Princess Elizabeth was more favored to be on the throne. She was seen as the queen that truly represented Britain and was seen as more moderate in her religious beliefs and would cater to both Catholics and Protestants. It was also heavily believed that Queen Mary was influenced by her Spanish roots. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was born in Spain, and in coming over here was heavily mistreated by King Henry VIII. Her mother would die without Queen Mary ever even being with her. So as a result, it would be natural that she would have some resentment toward Britain for the mistreatment of her and her people, and a high likeliness that she colluded with many of those from Spain in order to make this process happen. The rebellion began with these four gentlemen right here. We have Sir Peter Carew, who was a parliament man, from Devon. We have the Duke of Suffolk, who was the father of Lady Jane Grey, who was overthrown by Queen Mary and thrown in the Tower of London. The Duke of Suffolk's real name was Henry Grey, and wanted to free his daughter and overthrow Queen Mary for what she had done. Next, we have Sir Thomas Croft, a nobleman at the time, and then we have Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, as can be seen in the bottom right. He was a son of an adventurer who would go on to have his name be the face of the rebellion. I'll get to why that is insane. Initially, these four men had planned to start the rebellion in 4 separate locations on the same day. The initial plan was to start the rebellion on Palm Sunday, more specifically March 18th of 1554. They would start their rebellions all at once in their respective locations. The Duke of Suffolk starting in Leicestershire, Sir Peter Carew starting in Devon, Sir James Croft beginning his rebellion in the borders between Britain and Welsh, and Thomas Wyatt the Younger would begin his in Kent. However, it was leaked to the Queen that this plan was going to happen. And supposedly, it was leaked by Sir James Croft. And because of this, the rebellion was moved up to a closer date, and only 2 of the 4 ever really were able to materialize their efforts. The Duke of Norfolk, my mistake, attempted his, but was quickly defeated and captured. The only person who really was able to effectively start the rebellion was Thomas Wyatt, thus leading his name to be the face of the rebellion because he got farther. He was able to make it to London, whereas 2 of the others had never even began, and one was simply captured and thrown in the Tower of London along with his daughter. In heading to London, Wyatt actually found much support. Many of the soldiers who had been set out in small groups to attack him and stop the rebellion actually had sympathy for the man, saw the use of the cause, and joined in. They had managed to reach London, but unfortunately were stopped at the London Bridge. They did manage to loot some of the buildings that were essentially supportive of Queen Mary, but this repulsion set them back and they had to wait for 3 days. Keep in mind, this rebellion was not massive. It had about approximately 3,000 to 7,000 men on the side of Wyatt, give or take, because it is unclear how many had joined him on his way to London. However, in his 3 days' time, Mary was able to round up more support, amassing an army of 10,000 with subsequent cavalry of about 500 to 1,000. With this would be the turning point for the rebellion, shown here. Many men were killed on the side of Wyatt, and many were surprisingly pardoned after the event, after the quarrel. The rebellion had failed, essentially. And it would only get worse before it ever got better. After the defeat in London, even though she had no association with the rebellion at all, but was simply mentioned as favorite by Thomas Wyatt and the others, Queen Elizabeth was thrown into the Tower of London and imprisoned, alongside Sir James Croft, the supposed leaker of the plan. And it's actually because of this that the two became quite close. They would become friends, and Sir James Croft would actually hold a high position in the reign of Queen Elizabeth afterwards. But I digress. As I mentioned, the Duke had been thrown into the Tower of London along with Thomas Wyatt and Lady Jane Grey. From this, they were set for execution. And many of the other rebels were simply pardoned and or fined. And the reason they were fined was so that they would not start a second rebellion, and that would deter anyone from trying to overthrow Queen Mary again. The other leaders got off fairly easily. As I mentioned, Sir James Croft was imprisoned but spared. Many were pardoned and fined. And surprisingly, Sir Peter Carew was able to escape to Scotland and was exiled there for some time before returning back to England later on after the whole debacle had resolved itself, essentially. Unfortunately, as a result of the rebellion, many lost their lives, including the very man who the rebellion was named after. Thomas Wyatt, as shown in the top right, was executed along with Lady Jane Grey and the Duke of Suffolk, Henry Grey. They had all been seen as conspirators and were beheaded. Some accounts say that Thomas Wyatt was given the traitor's execution, his body later drawn and quartered and mutilated afterwards. This wasn't the end of it, though. Queen Mary saw this as her being too lenient on the Protestant faction of Britain, and thus sought to persecute all of them, hunting many down and burning hundreds at the stake. This is recorded in books such as John Fox's Book of Martyrs. This was the era known as the Reign of Bloody Mary, purely because she killed without discretion, killing many notable members as well, one of which being Thomas Cranmer on the top left over here, who was also burned at the stake for supporting Protestant leaders beforehand. Thankfully, Queen Elizabeth was spared. She was detained in the Tower of London for a time, moved to a stockade, and then subsequently placed under house arrest later on. Thankfully, Queen Mary would succumb to an illness and die, allowing for Queen Elizabeth to take the throne and restore England to a ruler who genuinely had the interests of the British people in her heart, would be very accepting of both Protestant and Catholic beliefs, and be an overall better ruler that represented Britain more than Queen Mary. Thank you. This has been a heavy research into the Wyatt Rebellion, an overall interesting topic and overall odd occurrence of events, and a demonstration of what happens when you simply do not listen to your subjects or care for their needs, only servicing yourself. Thank you.